You stare at opportunities that could transform your career, but fear holds you back while others seem to effortlessly seize the moment. Every day you watch colleagues take bold moves that pay off spectacularly, while you remain trapped in the safety of what you know, wondering if you'll ever have the courage to make your own decisive leap. I am Napoleon Bonaparte, the artillery officer who became Emperor of France by mastering the art of calculated risk-taking. What I discovered about strategic risk will transform how you approach every opportunity, showing you exactly how to evaluate, prepare, and execute bold moves with confidence rather than reckless abandon. The same principles that helped me conquer most of Europe can help you conquer your fears and seize the opportunities that others are too cautious to pursue. But first, like this video, subscribe for more imperial wisdom, and comment your location below. Let's see which corners of the world are ready to master the art of calculated risk-taking. I was born on an island of rebels, where risk was not a choice but a necessity for survival. Corsica had just been sold to France by the Genoese, and my family found ourselves caught between worlds, neither fully Corsican nor truly French. This taught me my first lesson about calculated risk. Sometimes your greatest disadvantage can become your most powerful advantage if you learn to use it strategically. My father, Charles Bonaparte, made a calculated risk that would change everything. He chose to align with the French rather than continue the hopeless rebellion led by Pasquale Paoli. Many called him a traitor, but I watched him navigate this decision with cold precision. He weighed the odds: continue fighting an unwinnable war or secure his family's future by adapting to new realities. This wasn't cowardice, it was calculation. At 9 years old, I found myself at the military school in Brienne-le-Château, another calculated risk my father had made. He gambled that education would give his son opportunities that Corsican pride never could. I was the foreign boy with the strange accent, mocked by aristocratic classmates who saw me as an outsider. But this isolation forced me to develop something more valuable than social acceptance: the ability to observe, analyze, and calculate without emotional interference. The mathematics of artillery became my first real education in calculated risk. Every cannon shot required precise calculations: distance, wind speed, powder charge. Miss any variable, and you waste ammunition, time, and potentially lives. But master these calculations, and you could place a cannonball exactly where you needed it. I spent countless hours studying trajectories and probabilities, not knowing I was learning the fundamental skills of strategic risk assessment. What fascinated me most was how small adjustments in calculation could produce dramatically different outcomes. Raise the cannon's angle by just 2 degrees, and your shot could travel 50 yards further. This taught me that precision in preparation could dramatically multiply the effectiveness of any risk you take. The difference between a calculated risk and a reckless gamble often comes down to these small but crucial details. My fellow students focused on memorizing drill formations and polishing their boots. I focused on understanding why certain strategies worked and others failed. I read everything I could about great military campaigns, not for entertainment, but to identify patterns. What made Alexander successful? Why did certain Roman generals consistently win while others lost with similar resources? I was unconsciously developing what would become my greatest asset: the ability to extract principles from past events and apply them to new situations. The real breakthrough came when I began to see connections between mathematical precision and human behavior. Just as you could predict where a cannonball would land by calculating physical forces, you could often predict how people would react by understanding their motivations, fears, and patterns. This insight would later allow me to take risks that seemed impossible to others, but were actually quite calculated when you understood the human variables involved. My first major calculated risk came during the French Revolution. While my classmates tried to avoid taking sides. I saw opportunity in the chaos. The old order was crumbling, and those willing to bet on the new system could rise faster than ever before possible. I wrote a political pamphlet supporting the revolution, risky move for a young officer. But I had calculated that the revolutionary government would need competent military leaders, and would reward those who showed early loyalty. This decision isolated me from many fellow officers who remained loyal to the monarchy, but it also brought me to the attention of revolutionary leaders who valued both military skill and political reliability. I had risked my standing with the old guard to position myself with the new power structure. Many called it opportunism, but I called it reading the situation accurately and positioning myself accordingly. The transformation from the awkward Corsican boy to the confident young officer didn't happen overnight. It was the result of thousands of small, calculated risks, speaking up in class despite my accent, volunteering for challenging assignments, studying while others socialized. Each risk built upon the previous one, creating a compound effect that eventually transformed not just my capabilities, but my entire understanding of how to navigate uncertainty. Before I ever set foot on a battlefield as a commander, I learned the most crucial lesson of calculated risk-taking. You must always know exactly what you can afford to lose. This principle saved my empire more times than my victories ever did, because it prevented me from making the kind of desperate gambles that destroy men who confuse boldness with recklessness. The lesson came to me during my first real test of command at the Battle of Lodi Bridge in 1796. I was 26 years old, leading the army of Italy in what most considered a hopeless campaign. The Austrian forces were retreating across the Ada River, and they had positioned their cannons to sweep the bridge with devastating fire. My generals advised waiting for reinforcements or finding another crossing. Both were safe, reasonable options that would have preserved our forces. But I had calculated something they missed. Yes, attempting to cross that bridge would cost us casualties, perhaps significant ones. But allowing the Austrians to escape intact would cost us the entire campaign. I could accept the loss of perhaps 200 men if it meant capturing or destroying 4,000 Austrian troops and opening the road to Milan. The mathematics were clear, even if the human cost was difficult to contemplate. I made my decision based on what I could afford to lose versus what I stood to gain. I could afford to lose those men because I had reserves, because the strategic position was worth the tactical cost, and because failure to act would result in even greater losses later. This wasn't callousness, it was calculation. Every great leader must learn to think beyond the immediate emotional impact to the larger strategic picture. What made this a calculated risk rather than a desperate gamble was my preparation for failure. I had positioned our forces so that if the bridge assault failed, we could withdraw in good order and attempt the river crossing at another point. I had not committed everything to this single action. The acceptable loss principle demands that you never risk more than you can survive losing. When I personally sighted the cannons that would support our assault, earning me the nickname Le Petit Caporal, I was demonstrating another aspect of acceptable loss, the leader's willingness to share the risks he asks others to take. My soldiers saw me in the same danger they faced, which transformed their perception of the risk, from something imposed upon them to something we were all choosing together. The bridge assault succeeded, but even if it had failed, I had limited my potential losses to what the campaign could absorb. This principle guided every major decision I made throughout my career. During the Austerlitz campaign, I calculated that I could afford to let the Austro-Russian forces think they had trapped me, even though this meant accepting the risk of a real trap. The potential gain drawing them into a decisive battle on ground of my choosing was worth the acceptable loss of appearing temporarily weak. I developed a framework that I used for every major risk throughout my career. First, Define your maximum acceptable loss in concrete terms: money, political capital, time, reputation. Second, ensure that even if you lose the maximum amount, you can still continue pursuing your larger objectives. Third, structure the risk so that partial success still provides meaningful gain. Finally, maintain reserves that allow you to either exploit unexpected success or manage unexpected failure. This principle extends far beyond military campaigns. When I decided to crown myself emperor, I calculated that I could afford to lose the support of the die-hard Republicans, who still dreamed of pure revolutionary government. Their disapproval was an acceptable loss because I had already secured the support of the broader population who craved stability more than ideology. I could not afford to lose the support of the army or the administrative class, who actually ran the country on a daily basis. The most difficult aspect of acceptable loss is learning to think coldly about things you care about deeply. I cared about every soldier under my command, but I had to accept that preserving the lives of some might require risking the lives of others. I cared about my reputation, but I had to accept that some decisions would make me temporarily unpopular if they served the larger strategy. Many leaders fail because they cannot bring themselves to accept any loss, so they end up losing everything. They refuse to sacrifice a small position to save a large one, or they won't risk short-term criticism to achieve long-term success. This paralysis in the face of necessary trade-offs destroys more careers and enterprises than enemy action ever could. The principle of acceptable loss also means knowing when a risk has become unacceptable. My invasion of Russia violated this principle, convinced myself that I could afford losses that in reality would cripple my ability to maintain control over the rest of Europe. I let my desire for a decisive victory override my calculation of sustainable costs. This violation of my own principle cost me everything I had built. Every calculated risk you take should begin with this question: what is the maximum I can afford to lose? And can I achieve my larger objectives even if I lose that amount? If you cannot answer both parts of that question clearly, you are not ready to take the risk. ****. I built the most sophisticated intelligence network in European history because I learned early that uninformed risk is simply gambling with better uniforms. The difference between a calculated risk and blind luck often comes down to a single crucial piece of information that others don't possess. I made it my business to know what others didn't know, and that knowledge multiplied the effectiveness of every risk. I took my approach to intelligence gathering began during my artillery training, where I learned that accurate information could mean the difference between hitting your target and wasting expensive ammunition. This lesson expanded into a life philosophy: never make a major decision without first gathering every piece of relevant information you can obtain. While other commanders relied on luck and bravery, I relied on facts and preparation. I established a network of agents, informants, and observers that stretched across Europe and beyond. But this wasn't just about military intelligence. I gathered information about economics, politics, personal relationships, individual character traits, and even gossip that might seem irrelevant to others. I understood that in the interconnected world of European politics, a banker's financial troubles in Vienna might affect a general's decision-making in Prague, which could influence the timing of my own campaigns. My intelligence system operated on multiple levels. At the strategic level, I needed to understand the grand political movements, which alliances were strengthening, which were weakening, where economic pressures might force political changes. At the operational level, I needed to know troop movements, supply situations, and command structures. At the tactical level, I needed to understand individual personalities, because wars are ultimately fought by people, and people are predictable if you understand their motivations and fears. What set my intelligence gathering apart was my understanding that information is only valuable if it arrives in time to act upon it. I created the fastest communication network in Europe, using a combination of mounted messengers, signal fires, and even early optical telegraph systems. Speed of information often mattered more than completeness of information. A partially accurate report that arrived in time to influence my decisions was more valuable than a perfectly accurate report that arrived too late. I also understood that information flows both ways. While I was gathering intelligence about my enemies, they were attempting to gather intelligence about me. This meant that controlling what information my enemies received was almost as important as gathering information about them. I became a master of disinformation, feeding false intelligence through channels I knew were compromised, allowing my enemies to discover information that would lead them to make the decisions I wanted them to make. One of my most successful uses of intelligence came before the Battle of Austerlitz. I had learned through my network that the Austro-Russian coalition was under pressure to achieve a quick victory due to financial constraints and political tensions between the allies. I also knew that both emperors were present with the army, which meant that political considerations would influence military decisions. Finally, I had detailed intelligence about the personalities of their senior commanders, particularly their tendency toward conventional thinking and their underestimation of my capabilities. Armed with this information, I calculated that I could take the enormous risk of appearing weak and trapped, because I knew my enemies would be unable to resist the temptation to attack me decisively rather than continuing their more cautious approach. This wasn't a gamble, it was a calculated risk based on comprehensive intelligence about my opponent's constraints, motivations, and decision-making patterns. But gathering information is only half the challenge. The other half is learning to evaluate and interpret what you learn. I developed systems for cross-checking intelligence from multiple sources, for identifying when information might be deliberately false, and for extracting meaningful patterns from seemingly unrelated facts. I learned to distinguish between what was certainly true, what was probably true, what was possibly true, and what was certainly false. I also learned to gather intelligence about myself, understanding how others perceived me, what they expected me to do, and what assumptions they were making about my capabilities and intentions. This self-awareness allowed me to either reinforce useful misconceptions or correct dangerous ones. If my enemies underestimated me, I could use that to my advantage. If they overestimated me, I needed to either live up to their expectations or find ways to reduce their vigilance. The principle extends beyond military campaigns to every area of life where you might take calculated risks. Before I agreed to any political alliance, I gathered detailed intelligence about my potential partners, their financial situation, their domestic political pressures, their personal relationships, their past patterns of behavior in similar situations. This information allowed me to structure agreements that accounted for their likely future actions, not just their current promises. When I decided to implement the continental system to challenge British economic power, I first gathered extensive intelligence about European trade patterns, the financial health of various merchant classes, and the political stability of governments that would be affected by the policy. This information helped me calculate which countries would comply willingly, which would require pressure, and which would actively resist, regardless of consequences. My intelligence network also helped me understand timing, not just what might happen, but when it was likely to happen. This temporal intelligence was crucial for risk calculation because the same action could be brilliantly successful if taken at the right moment, and disastrously unsuccessful if mistimed by even a few weeks. The greatest mistake leaders make is taking action based on assumptions rather than intelligence. They assume their competitors will behave rationally, that markets will follow historical patterns, that people will act in their own self-interest, but assumptions are just guesses dressed up as facts. Real intelligence reveals the gap between what should happen and what actually will happen. Every major risk you contemplate should begin with intelligence gathering. What don't you know that could affect the outcome? Who has the information you need? How can you verify what you learn? What false information might you be receiving? How will the situation change over time? Answer these questions before you calculate your risk, and you transform uncertainty into manageable probability. Asterisk, asterisk, I may lose a battle, but I shall never lose a minute. This principle guided every calculated risk I took throughout my career, because I understood that speed itself could transform a dangerous gamble into a winning certainty. When you move faster than your opposition expects, you create windows of opportunity that don't exist for those who hesitate. Speed multiplies the power of every other advantage you possess. The foundation of my speed-based strategy came from studying the campaigns of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. Both commanders understood that rapid movement could compensate for numerical disadvantage, that striking before enemies could coordinate their response often meant fighting several smaller battles instead of one large, dangerous one. But I took this principle further than they did. Because I had advantages, they lacked better roads, more disciplined logistics, and the telegraph system that allowed me to coordinate faster than any commander in history. My speed wasn't just about moving armies quickly across the landscape. It was about accelerating every aspect of decision-making and execution. While my enemies held councils of war that lasted for days, I made command decisions in hours. While they waited for perfect intelligence, I acted on sufficient intelligence. While they prepared elaborate plans, I adapted simple principles to changing circumstances. This speed of thought translated into speed of action, which translated into strategic advantage. The Austrian campaign of 1805 demonstrated how speed could turn a potentially catastrophic situation into a brilliant victory. I had learned through my intelligence network that Austria and Russia were planning to coordinate their armies to crush me with overwhelming numbers. The traditional response would have been to concentrate my forces defensively and wait for their attack. Instead, I calculated that I could use speed to prevent their coordination from ever occurring. I moved the Grandi army faster than anyone thought possible, striking at the Austrian forces under General Mack at Ulm before the Russians could arrive to support them. This wasn't recklessness, it was calculated aggression based on precise timing. I had calculated how long it would take the Russians to march to support the Austrians, and I knew that if I could defeat the Austrians within that time frame, I would face two separate, manageable fights instead of one impossible one. The risk was enormous. If my forces had been delayed by weather, logistics problems, or unexpected resistance, I would have found myself trapped between two larger armies with no possibility of retreat. But I had prepared for speed. My logistics were designed for rapid movement. My officers were trained to make quick decisions without waiting for detailed orders, and my soldiers were conditioned to march longer distances in shorter time than any other army in Europe. Speed also gave me psychological advantages that pure force could never provide. When I moved faster than enemies expected, I created doubt and confusion in their ranks. Commanders who had planned for weeks to face me at a particular time and place suddenly found me somewhere else entirely, forcing them to abandon their careful preparations and react to my initiative rather than pursuing their own plans. This psychological disruption often decided battles before the first shot was fired. But speed without direction is just panic, and speed without preparation is just rashness. My rapid movements were always guided by clear strategic objectives and supported by meticulous advanced planning. I studied every road, every bridge, every supply depot along potential routes of advance. I knew exactly how long each movement would take under various weather conditions. I had contingency plans for mechanical breakdowns, enemy resistance, and logistical delays. I also understood that speed required accepting certain types of risk that slower, more methodical approaches could avoid. When you move quickly, you sometimes commit to actions before you have complete information. You must make decisions based on probabilities rather than certainties. You must trust your subordinates to handle unexpected situations without constant guidance. But these risks were acceptable because the alternative, moving slowly enough to avoid all uncertainty, guaranteed that enemies would have time to concentrate superior forces against you. The principle of speed as strategic advantage extended beyond military campaigns into every aspect of governance and diplomacy. When I decided to crown myself emperor, I moved quickly to consolidate the necessary political support before opposition could organize. When I negotiated with the Catholic Church, I pushed for rapid resolution because I knew that extended negotiations would give opponents time to undermine the process. When I implemented legal reforms, I drove them through quickly enough that established interests couldn't mount effective resistance. Speed also meant recognizing when opportunities were fleeting and acting decisively to capture them. The coup of 18 Brumaire succeeded because I understood that the political situation in France was unstable enough to allow for radical change, but only for a brief window of time. Wait too long, and either the Directory would stabilize its position or someone else would seize the initiative. I calculated that swift action during this narrow window offered better odds than waiting for a more perfect opportunity that might never come. My speed-based approach to calculated risk-taking required developing what I called tempo sensitivity, the ability to sense when events were moving quickly enough to create opportunities and when they were moving slowly enough to allow for careful preparation. Some situations demanded immediate action. Others punished premature movement. Learning to distinguish between these different temporal environments was crucial for successful risk calculation. The biggest mistake most people make with speed is confusing it with haste. Haste is moving quickly without preparation or purpose. Speed is moving quickly because you have prepared thoroughly and identified a time-sensitive opportunity. Haste leads to errors and oversights that destroy the value of rapid movement. Speed leverages preparation to capture advantages that slower competitors cannot reach. Every calculated risk you consider should include an analysis of timing. How long will this opportunity remain available? How quickly can you move to capture it? What advantages would speed provide? What risks would speed create? How can you prepare to move quickly when the moment comes? Master the relationship between speed and calculation, and you will find opportunities that others never see and capture advantages that others never reach. Asterisk, asterisk. Never take a risk that leaves you with only one possible outcome. This principle saved my empire repeatedly and taught me that the most dangerous risks are not the ones that might fail, but the ones that leave you with no alternatives if they do fail. True calculated risk-taking requires building multiple paths to success and multiple escape routes from failure. The art lies in creating these options before you need them. I learned this lesson during my Italian campaigns when I watched other commanders commit their entire armies to single objectives, leaving themselves vulnerable to any unexpected development. When General Wurmser attempted to relieve the siege of Mantua, he put everything into one massive assault. His plan was brilliant, his execution was competent, but he had created no alternatives. When I defeated his assault, he had no choice but surrender. His single path to victory became his only path to destruction. I structured my campaigns differently. When I besieged Mantua, I maintained multiple options for dealing with relief. Attempts I could fight them directly. I could abandon the siege temporarily and defeat them in the field, or I could divide my forces and do both simultaneously. This flexibility meant that whatever the Austrians tried, I had prepared responses that could turn their moves to my advantage, Creating options requires understanding that every action you take should, if possible, improve your position regardless of how your immediate opponents respond. When I decided to invade Egypt, it wasn't just about conquering Egypt itself. If the campaign succeeded militarily, I would have established a new base for challenging British power in the East. If it succeeded politically but failed militarily, I would have enhanced my reputation as a bold leader willing to attempt great enterprises. If it failed entirely but I survived, I would return to France as a romantic hero whose failure only proved his willingness to take risks for the nation's glory. The Egyptian campaign taught me another crucial aspect of creating options. Sometimes the most valuable outcome is not the one you originally planned. I went to Egypt seeking military victory and found political opportunity. The campaign's mixed military results became irrelevant when events in France created the perfect moment for my return and eventual rise to power. By structuring the risk to provide multiple types of value, I ensured that even unexpected developments could work in my favor. I applied this same principle to diplomatic relationships throughout my career. I never allied with just one partner when I could cultivate relationships with several potential allies. When I negotiated with Austria, I simultaneously maintained communications with Prussia and Russia. This wasn't duplicity, was strategic option creation. If negotiations with Austria failed, I had alternatives. If they succeeded, I had leverage to improve the terms by demonstrating that I had other choices. The Treaty of Campo Formio demonstrated how multiple options could transform a difficult negotiation into a triumphant success. I had created several possible outcomes: a peace that left me in control of northern Italy, a peace that gave me Belgium in exchange for Italian territories, or continued war that would further enhance my military reputation. The Austrians found themselves negotiating against all these possibilities, which gave me enormous leverage to achieve terms that seemed impossible when negotiations began. Creating options also means preparing for success as carefully as you prepare for failure. Many people plan for what to do if their risks don't work out, but they don't plan for what to do if their risks succeed beyond expectations. When my victories in Italy brought me sudden fame and political influence, I was ready to leverage that success into greater opportunities because I had anticipated the possibility and prepared for it. I developed what I called branching strategies, plans, that deliberately created decision points where I could choose between multiple courses of action based on how events developed. Instead of committing to a single path from beginning to end, I committed to reaching certain intermediate positions from which several different paths would be available. This approach meant that new information or unexpected opportunities could be incorporated into my plans rather than forcing me to abandon them. The principle extended to resource allocation as well. I never committed all my reserves to a single objective, no matter how promising it appeared. During the Austerlitz campaign, even when I was confident of victory, I maintained reserves that could either exploit an unexpected breakthrough or cover an unexpected setback. These uncommitted resources were my insurance against the unknown, my guarantee that I would have options even if my primary plan failed. Creating options requires accepting that you might not achieve the maximum possible gain from any single risk, because you're investing some resources in alternatives that you may never use. But this apparent limitation is actually a multiplier of your overall success rate, because it allows you to take larger risks with greater confidence. When you know you have alternatives, you can pursue ambitious primary objectives without fear that failure will leave you helpless. I also learned to create what I called reversible commitments, actions that appeared decisive to observers, but could actually be undone or redirected if circumstances changed. When the first crossed the Rubicon by accepting the crown of Emperor, I made sure to structure the transition in ways that preserved options for different types of imperial rule depending on how the French people responded to the change. The most sophisticated aspect of option creation is building what appear to be disadvantages that are actually disguised advantages. When I allowed myself to appear vulnerable before a blitz, I was creating the option to spring a trap while maintaining the option to fight a conventional defensive battle if my deception failed. My apparent weakness was actually a form of strategic flexibility. Modern risk-takers often trap themselves by pursuing strategies that require everything to go according to plan. They create elaborate schemes that work brilliantly if all assumptions prove correct, but collapse catastrophically if any significant variable changes. Instead, structure your risks to provide value under multiple scenarios. Maintain uncommitted resources that can be deployed as opportunities develop. And always ask yourself, if this doesn't work out as I expect, what other valuable outcomes might still be possible? The greatest risks are those that leave you with only one definition of success. The most calculated risks are those that can succeed in several different ways and provide valuable lessons even if they fail entirely. Create options, and you transform dangerous gambles into strategic advantages. ***, understanding your competition matters more than understanding yourself, because your opponent's predictable patterns become your greatest strategic assets. I won most of my victories not through superior force or perfect planning, but by reading my enemies so accurately that I could anticipate their moves and position myself to benefit from their decisions. When you can predict how others will respond to your actions, calculated risk becomes calculated certainty. I began developing this skill during my early military career by studying not just military history, but the personal histories of the commanders I might face. I learned that General Melas was methodical and conservative, preferring defensive positions to aggressive maneuvers. I discovered that Archduke Charles was brilliant tactically, but hesitant strategically, often failing to press advantages when they appeared. I found that General Kutuzov was patient and cunning, willing to trade space for time and always looking for opportunities to turn apparent defeats into strategic victories. This intelligence about individual psychology proved more valuable than intelligence about troop numbers or supply situations. Numbers could be changed, supplies could be replenished, but personality patterns rarely shifted under pressure. If anything, stress made people more predictable, not less, because it forced them back to their fundamental instincts and training. My approach to reading opponents operated on multiple levels simultaneously. At the personal level, I studied individual commanders' biographical details, their educational background, their previous career experiences, their political connections, their personal relationships. A general who had risen through political connections rather than battlefield success would likely prioritize avoiding failure over achieving victory. A commander who had been defeated previously by unconventional tactics would probably overreact to any signs of unorthodox approaches. At the institutional level, I analyzed the military cultures and political constraints that shaped my opponents' decision-making. Austrian generals operated within a command structure that punished individual initiative and rewarded adherence to established doctrine. This meant they would likely respond to unexpected situations by following standard procedures, rather than adapting creatively. Russian commanders dealt with extreme distances and communication delays, which made them prefer simple, robust strategies that could survive inevitable misunderstandings and delays. At the strategic level, I studied the larger political and economic pressures that influenced my opponent's choices. A coalition held together by competing interests would eventually break apart under pressure, especially if I could identify which members had the most to lose from continued conflict. A nation fighting far from home would be more sensitive to casualties and supply problems than one defending its own territory. The Battle of Austerlitz demonstrated how reading opponents could transform a desperate situation into a masterpiece of strategic manipulation. I had identified that the Austro-Russian coalition was under enormous pressure to achieve a quick victory. The emperors were present with the army, which meant that political considerations would override military prudence. The commanders were operating under the assumption that I was trapped and weak, which would make them overconfident and aggressive. Most importantly, I had read the personality of Tsar Alexander, who was young, impetuous, and eager to prove himself. As a military leader, I calculated that he would override the more cautious advice of his experienced generals in favor of a bold attack that would give him personal glory. By appearing vulnerable and retreating from the Pratzen Heights, I created exactly the kind of tempting opportunity that Alexander's personality made him unable to resist. The deception worked perfectly because it was based on accurate psychological assessment rather than wishful thinking. I didn't hope that Alexander would attack prematurely. I knew he would, because attacking prematurely was consistent with everything I had learned about his character, his political situation, and his relationship with his military advisors. I also learned to read the patterns within patterns. Austrian generals didn't just prefer defensive positions. They preferred specific types of defensive positions that they had been taught were proper according to their military doctrine. This meant I could often predict not just that they would defend, but where and how they would deploy their defenses. Russian commanders didn't just value patience, they valued specific forms of patience that reflected their experience fighting on the vast steppes of their homeland. Reading opponents also meant understanding their information sources and decision-making processes. If I knew how my enemies gathered intelligence, I could influence what intelligence they received. If I understood their command structure, I could predict how long it would take them to make decisions and coordinate responses. If I knew their logistical constraints, I could anticipate when they would be forced to act. Regardless of strategic considerations, the most sophisticated aspect of reading opponents was learning to use their strengths against them. Methodical. Commanders like Malas were excellent at executing well-planned operations, but this same methodical nature made them slow to adapt when plans went wrong. Aggressive commanders like Prince Jerome were excellent at seizing opportunities, but this same aggressiveness made them vulnerable to traps disguised as opportunities. I developed profiles for each major opponent that included not just their typical patterns, but also their likely responses under different types of pressure. How would they react if cut off from supplies? How would they behave if they believed they had overwhelming advantage? How would they respond to unexpected tactical innovations? How would they adapt if their initial plans failed? This psychological intelligence allowed me to engineer situations where my opponent's natural reactions would work to my advantage. I could create apparent opportunities that would draw aggressive commanders into traps, or create apparent threats that would cause defensive commanders to abandon strong positions. The art was making my enemies predictable responses. Part of my own strategic plan, reading opponents, extends far beyond military applications. In negotiations, understanding the other party's constraints, priorities, and decision-making patterns allows you to structure proposals that they will find difficult to refuse. In competitive business situations, understanding competitors, organizational cultures, financial pressures, and leadership personalities helps. You predict their responses to your initiatives and position yourself accordingly. The greatest mistake most people make is assuming that their opponents will respond rationally to objective circumstances. But people don't respond to objective circumstances. They respond to their interpretation of circumstances, filtered through their experience, training, personality, and immediate pressures. Learn to read these filters, and you can predict behavior with remarkable accuracy. Every calculated risk should include analysis of how key players will likely respond to your actions. What are their typical patterns? What pressures are they under? What would success look like to them? What would failure cost them? What information will they have when they make their decisions? Answer these questions, and you transform uncertainty about others' actions into manageable probability assessments that make your own risk calculations far more reliable. Asterisk, asterisk, the night before Austerlitz, I wrote to Josephine with complete confidence of victory, yet I had also prepared detailed contingency plans for retreat and regrouping. This duality, absolute confidence paired with realistic preparation for failure, represents the psychological foundation of calculated boldness. You must train your mind to hold to opposing truths simultaneously, that you will succeed and that you might fail. Most people fail at calculated risk-taking because they cannot master this psychological paradox. They either become paralyzed by focusing too much on potential failure, or they become reckless by refusing to acknowledge that failure is possible. True calculated boldness requires developing what I call confident pessimism, the ability to act with complete conviction while maintaining realistic awareness of what could go wrong. I developed this mindset through years of systematic mental training that began during my artillery studies. Every mathematical calculation required absolute precision, but every battlefield application occurred under conditions of uncertainty, incomplete information, and active enemy interference. I learned to hold my calculations lightly enough to adapt them to changing circumstances, but firmly enough to act decisively when action was required. The psychological foundation of calculated boldness rests on understanding the difference between emotional confidence and strategic confidence. Emotional confidence comes from feeling good about your chances and tends to fluctuate based on mood, recent experiences, and social feedback. Strategic confidence comes from having done the analytical work necessary to understand your situation accurately and having prepared appropriately for multiple outcomes. Before every major risk, I performed what I called mental rehearsal, systematically imagining how I would respond to various scenarios, both positive and negative. If the battle went according to plan, how would I exploit the victory? If unexpected setbacks occurred, how would I adapt my tactics? If everything went wrong, how would I preserve my forces and maintain my strategic position? This mental preparation meant that no outcome would find me psychologically unprepared. I also developed rituals that helped me maintain psychological equilibrium under extreme pressure. On the morning of a major battle, I would review my maps one final time, not because I needed more information, but because the familiar routine helped calm my mind and remind me that I had prepared thoroughly. I would visit my soldiers, not just to inspire them, but to draw energy from their confidence in my leadership. I would write letters to Josephine, not just to maintain our connection, but to remind myself of what I was fighting to protect and build. The most crucial psychological skill for calculated risk-taking is learning to separate your sense of personal worth from the outcome of any individual risk. My identity was not dependent on winning any particular battle. It was built on the consistent application of sound principles over time. This detachment allowed me to take larger risks with greater calm, because I knew that even significant failures would not destroy my fundamental capabilities or future opportunities. I learned to distinguish between reasonable fears that should inform my planning and irrational fears that could paralyze my decision-making. Fear of enemy counterattacks was reasonable and led me to position reserves appropriately. Fear of looking foolish if unconventional tactics failed was irrational and could prevent me from taking calculated risks that offered genuine advantages. I developed the ability to acknowledge fears without being controlled by them. Another essential element of calculated boldness is maintaining what I call operational optimism, the belief that skillful execution can overcome most obstacles, even when you acknowledge that obstacles will certainly appear. This isn't naive optimism that expects everything to go smoothly. It's sophisticated optimism based on confidence in your ability to adapt, improvise, and persist when circumstances don't develop as expected. The psychology of calculated boldness also requires accepting that some degree of anxiety is not only normal but beneficial. Complete absence of nervous energy often indicates that you haven't fully grasped the magnitude of what you're attempting. The goal is not to eliminate anxiety, but to channel it into heightened attention, more thorough preparation, and greater sensitivity to changing conditions during execution. I cultivated what I called constructive paranoia, constantly asking myself what could go wrong and how I could prepare for it, without allowing these thoughts to prevent decisive action when the time came. This mental habit helped me identify potential problems early enough to address them, while avoiding the trap of endless preparation that prevents any action at all. The most dangerous psychological trap in risk-taking is the illusion that you can control outcomes through perfect planning. You cannot. You can influence probabilities through intelligent preparation, but you cannot guarantee results. Accepting this limitation paradoxically increases your effectiveness, because it forces you to focus on what you can control: your preparation, your decision-making process, your response to unexpected developments, rather than what you cannot control. Also learned the importance of psychological recovery after both successes and failures. After victories, I had to resist the temptation to become overconfident and start taking poorly calculated risks. After defeats, I had to resist the temptation to become overly cautious and miss opportunities for recovery. Both extremes could destroy the psychological equilibrium necessary for consistent, calculated risk-taking. Managing the psychology of others was equally important. My soldiers needed to see confidence in my demeanor, even when I was privately concerned about aspects of our situation. My subordinate commanders needed to understand the reasoning behind our strategies, so they could maintain their own confidence and adapt intelligently if circumstances changed. My political allies needed to believe that I had calculated the risks appropriately and prepared for various outcomes. The final psychological element of calculated boldness is learning to enjoy the process of risk-taking itself, rather than just the rewards that successful risks might bring. When you derive satisfaction from the intellectual challenge of analyzing complex situations, preparing for multiple contingencies, and executing under pressure, you become more willing to take appropriate risks and more resilient when individual risks don't produce the outcomes you hoped for. Calculated boldness is not a natural talent, it's a developed skill that requires systematic practice and mental discipline. Start with smaller risks, where the stakes are manageable, but the psychological challenges are real. Practice the mental habits of confidence paired with realism, optimism paired with preparation, and conviction paired with adaptability. Over time, you'll develop the psychological foundation necessary to take larger, more consequential risks with the calm confidence that separates calculated boldness from both reckless gambling and timid inaction. Asterisk, the same action that makes you a genius in favorable conditions can make you a fool in unfavorable ones. I learned this lesson through both triumph and disaster, and it taught me that reading external conditions correctly is often more important than having a brilliant strategy. The continental system that was supposed to bring Britain to its knees became one of my greatest strategic errors, not because the concept was flawed, but because I implemented it when conditions made success impossible. Understanding timing and market conditions begins with recognizing that you operate within systems much larger than yourself. No matter how powerful you become, external forces, economic cycles, political movements, technological changes, social trends will influence the success or failure of your calculated risks. Your job is not to control these forces, but to Read them accurately and align your actions with their natural direction whenever possible. I first grasped this principle during the Italian campaigns, when I realized that my military success was amplified by favorable political conditions throughout Europe. The old monarchical order was weakening, revolutionary ideas were spreading, and populations were beginning to value merit over birth. These broader trends meant that my victories carried political significance far beyond their immediate military value. I was riding a wave of historical change rather than fighting against it. The Egyptian campaign taught me the opposite lesson, how unfavorable conditions could undermine even well-executed plans. The campaign itself was militarily successful in many ways, but it occurred when European political conditions required my presence in France, not the Middle East. By the time I returned, the political situation had evolved in ways that made my absence costly rather than beneficial. The timing was wrong for the larger strategic objectives. Regardless of tactical successes, I developed a systematic approach to reading what I called the strategic environment, the combination of political, economic, military, and social factors that would influence the success of any major undertaking. Before committing to significant risks, I analyzed multiple environmental indicators to determine whether conditions favored action or patience. Political conditions were often the most important factor in my calculations. The coup of 18 Brumaire succeeded primarily because French political conditions were perfect. For it, the Directory was weak and unpopular. The economy was struggling, military threats were pressing, and people craved strong leadership. The same action attempted 2 years earlier or 2 years later would likely have failed because the political environment would not have supported it. Economic conditions shaped the possibilities for both military campaigns and domestic reforms. My ability to fund large armies depended on the health of French finances, which in turn depended on successful campaigns that brought in tribute and indemnities. This created a cycle where military success enabled economic strength, which enabled larger military efforts. But it also meant that economic weakness could quickly spiral into military vulnerability if I didn't time my campaigns. To maintain this positive cycle, I learned to read what modern analysts might call market timing. In the context of European power politics, alliances went through cycles of strength and weakness. Nations experienced periods of internal stability and instability. Economic conditions created windows of opportunity and periods of constraint. By timing my major initiatives to coincide with favorable conditions and avoiding commitments during unfavorable periods, I multiplied the effectiveness of my efforts. The most sophisticated aspect of reading timing and conditions is understanding lag effects, how actions taken under one set of conditions create consequences that appear later under different conditions. The continental system seemed like brilliant strategy when British trade was vulnerable and European economies were strong enough to absorb the disruption. But by the time the system's negative effects became apparent, conditions had changed in ways that made the policy impossible to sustain. I also learned to distinguish between conditions I could influence and conditions I had to accept. I could influence the political stability of French satellites through my appointments and policies, but I could not control British naval supremacy or Russian winter weather. Successful timing meant taking action when factors I could control aligned favorably with factors I could not control. The principle of timing extends to recognizing when conditions are changing in your favor versus when they are changing against you. During my rise to power, almost every trend favored bold action. Military success bred political success, which enabled economic success, which funded military expansion. During my decline, the opposite dynamic took hold. Military setbacks created political vulnerabilities, which caused economic problems, which made military recovery more difficult. Weather and seasonal factors provided the most basic but crucial timing considerations. I learned to coordinate major campaigns with the agricultural calendar, ensuring that army movements didn't conflict with harvest seasons that provided necessary supplies. I planned sieges to conclude before winter weather made them unsustainable. I timed diplomatic initiatives to coincide with periods when travel and communication were reliable. The most dangerous timing mistake is falling in love with a strategy and pursuing it regardless of changing conditions. The continental system became counterproductive when economic conditions changed, but I persisted with it because I had invested so much political capital in its success. This inflexibility turned a calculated risk into a stubborn gamble that ultimately damaged my position more than abandoning it would have. I developed indicators that helped me recognize when conditions were shifting in significant ways. Changes in grain prices could signal economic stress that would affect military recruitment and financing. Diplomatic communications could reveal shifting alliance patterns before they became public. Military intelligence could identify when enemy capabilities were growing or declining. Cultural trends could indicate when populations were becoming more or less receptive to revolutionary ideas. Modern risk-takers face similar challenges in reading their environments. Economic cycles, technological disruptions, regulatory changes, social trends, and competitive dynamics all create periods when certain types of risks are more or less likely to succeed. The same business strategy that works brilliantly during economic expansion might fail during contraction. The same career move that succeeds in a growing industry might backfire in a declining one. The key to mastering timing and market conditions is developing sensitivity to multiple indicators simultaneously, while avoiding the paralysis of waiting for perfect conditions. Perfect conditions rarely exist. The goal is to recognize when conditions are favorable enough to justify action and when they are unfavorable enough to counsel patience. This requires balancing the risk of acting too early against the risk of acting too late. Every calculated risk should include analysis of the broader environment in which it will play out. What trends are working in your favor? What trends are working against you? How are conditions changing over time? What external events could dramatically alter the landscape? What indicators will tell you if conditions are shifting? Answer these questions before you act, and you align your calculated risks with forces larger than yourself rather than fighting against them. ***, you must have resources before you need them, because by the time you need them, it's too late to build them. This principle guided every aspect of my empire-building strategy and saved me from destruction more often than any brilliant tactic ever did. Strategic reserves, whether financial, political, military, or personnel, are what transform risky ventures into calculated investments. Without reserves, even small setbacks can become catastrophic failures. I learned this lesson watching other commanders who committed everything to their immediate objectives and left themselves vulnerable to any unexpected development. They achieved spectacular short-term successes, but collapsed when faced with circumstances they hadn't anticipated. I decided early in my career that maintaining reserves was more important than maximizing the resources committed to any single operation. Building strategic reserves requires thinking in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Financial reserves are the most obvious, maintaining funds that can be deployed quickly when opportunities arise or when unexpected challenges threaten your position. But equally important are political reserves, social reserves, intellectual reserves, and what I call credibility reserves that allow you to take risks that would destroy less well-prepared leaders. My financial approach centered on what I called productive accumulation, building wealth through activities that also advance my strategic objectives. Military campaigns that paid for themselves through conquest and tribute. Administrative reforms that increased tax efficiency while strengthening governmental control. Infrastructure projects that provided immediate economic benefits while creating long-term competitive advantages. This approach meant I was building reserves while pursuing my primary goals, rather than sacrificing current objectives for future security. Political reserves proved even more crucial than financial ones. I cultivated relationships with individuals and groups across the political spectrum, not because I agreed with all of them, but because I understood that political conditions change rapidly and allies can become enemies overnight. When the Directory fell, I had relationships with moderate Republicans who supported the coup. When I needed to negotiate with monarchical Europe, I had connections with nobles who had served the old regime. This political diversification provided options regardless of how circumstances evolved. I also built what I called institutional reserves, systems and structures that could function effectively even when I was absent or focused on other priorities. The administrative reforms that created the modern French bureaucracy, the legal frameworks that became the Napoleonic Code, the educational systems that trained competent officials, these institutional reserves allowed me to take military risks without worrying that domestic governance would collapse in my absence. Military reserves operated on multiple levels. At the tactical level, I never committed my entire force to the initial attack, always maintaining units that could exploit success or cover failure. At the operational level, I positioned secondary armies that could reinforce success or open alternative lines of operation if primary objectives proved unattainable. At the strategic level, I maintained alliances and treaties that provided access to additional resources if extended conflicts required them. The most sophisticated type of reserve I developed was credibility reserves, a reputation for competence and reliability that allowed me to take risks that would have destroyed leaders with less established track records. When I proposed the Egyptian expedition, the Directory approved it partly because my previous successes had earned their confidence. When I crowned myself emperor, the French people accepted it partly because I had consistently delivered on my promises. This credibility meant I could attempt ambitious projects with greater support and tolerance for temporary setbacks. Building reserves requires accepting opportunity costs. Resources you set aside for future contingencies cannot be used for current opportunities. This trade-off troubles many risk-takers who want to maximize their immediate gains. But I learned that reserves provide a multiplier effect that more than compensates for their opportunity cost. With adequate reserves, you can take larger risks. With greater confidence, pursue more ambitious objectives, and recover more quickly from inevitable setbacks. The principle extends to personal reserves as well. I maintained physical reserves through rigorous attention to my health and energy management, understanding that extended campaigns required stamina as well as strategy. I built intellectual reserves through constant reading and study, ensuring that I could draw on broad knowledge when facing novel problems. I developed emotional reserves through relationships and activities that provided satisfaction and renewal independent of my political and military objectives. Time reserves proved particularly valuable. By moving faster than opponents expected, I often created temporal advantages that functioned like other forms of strategic reserves. When I completed the ELM campaign weeks ahead of what Austrian planners thought possible, I had essentially created extra time that could be used for the Austerlitz campaign. This time advantage was as valuable as additional troops or finances. I also learned to recognize and exploit others' lack of reserves. Opponents who had committed everything to their current strategies became predictable and vulnerable. The Austrian Empire's financial exhaustion after repeated wars meant they had to seek peace even after military victories. The British economy's dependence on continental trade made it vulnerable to systematic economic pressure. Identifying these weaknesses in others' reserve positions allowed me to design strategies that exploited their vulnerabilities the most. dangerous mistake in reserve management is waiting until you have enough reserves before taking any significant risks. Enough is a moving target that rises as your ambitions grow. Instead, build reserves continuously while taking calculated risks with the resources you have available. This parallel approach means you're always building capacity for larger future risks while making progress on current objectives. Modern applications of strategic reserves include maintaining emergency funds while investing in opportunities, developing multiple skill sets while specializing in your primary area, building professional networks beyond your immediate industry, and creating systems that can operate without your constant attention. The specific forms change, but the principle remains constant. You must have resources before you need them. Different types of reserves have different accumulation timelines and different rates of depreciation. Financial reserves can be built relatively quickly but may lose value to inflation or opportunity costs. Relationship reserves take longer to build but tend to appreciate over time. Skill reserves require sustained investment but provide enduring value. Reputation reserves build slowly through consistent performance, but can be damaged quickly through poor decisions. The ultimate goal of building strategic reserves is not just to survive setbacks, but to position yourself to capitalize on opportunities that less prepared competitors cannot pursue. When market conditions shift dramatically, when political upheavals create new possibilities, when technological changes disrupt established patterns, these moments favor those who have reserves ready for deployment over those who are already operating at maximum capacity. Every calculated risk you contemplate should include analysis of what reserves you'll need if things go better or worse than expected, and what reserves you'll still have available after committing to this particular opportunity. Build reserves systematically, deploy them judiciously, and always remember that the goal is not to hoard resources, but to position yourself for larger, more consequential opportunities that require the security and flexibility that only adequate reserves can provide. Sometimes the biggest risk is playing it safe. This revelation came to me during the Italian campaigns when I realized that following conventional military wisdom would guarantee conventional results, which meant defeat against numerically superior enemies operating on interior lines. Calculated audacity means doing what experts say is impossible, but doing it for carefully reasoned strategic purposes rather than mere bravado or desperation. Conventional wisdom exists because it represents the accumulated experience of previous success and failure. But conventional wisdom also becomes a prison when circumstances change in ways that make traditional approaches inadequate or counterproductive. My greatest victories came from recognizing when conventional approaches would lead to conventional failures, and having the audacity to attempt unconventional solutions. Backed by rigorous analysis, the Italian campaign of 1796 demonstrated the power of calculated audacity against overwhelming odds. Traditional military doctrines said I should concentrate my forces defensively and wait for reinforcements. The mathematics of conventional warfare said I could not possibly defeat the combined Austrian and Piedmontese armies that outnumbered me significantly, but I calculated that speed and audacity could neutralize their numerical advantage by preventing them from coordinating their superior forces. I developed what I called the audacity calculation, a systematic method for determining when unconventional approaches offered better odds than conventional ones. First, analyze whether conventional approaches have any realistic chance of achieving your objectives given current constraints. Second, identify what unconventional approaches might be possible if you're willing to accept higher short-term risks. Third, calculate whether the unconventional approach's higher probability of dramatic success outweighs its higher probability of dramatic failure. The crossing of the Great St. Bernard Pass exemplified this calculation in action. Conventional wisdom said that moving an army of 40,000 men with artillery through the Alps in May was impossible. The weather was unpredictable, the logistics were nightmarish, and the physical challenges seemed insurmountable. But I calculated that this impossible approach offered strategic advantages that justified its tactical difficulties. If successful, the Alpine crossing would place my army where the Austrians least expected it, allowing me to defeat them before they could coordinate with their allies. If partially successful, it would still divide Austrian attention between multiple threat axes. Even if it failed partially, the demonstration of audacity would enhance my reputation and French morale while demoralizing enemies who thought they had me trapped in conventional positions. Calculated audacity requires distinguishing between intelligent rule-breaking and reckless rule-breaking. Intelligent rule-breaking occurs when you understand why the rules exist, recognize that changed circumstances have made them counterproductive, and have specific reasons for believing your alternative approach will work better. Reckless rule-breaking occurs when you ignore rules simply because they're inconvenient or because you want to appear bold. I studied every rule I chose to break, understanding both its historical logic and its current limitations. Military doctrine said armies should always maintain secure lines of communication, but I calculated that my superior speed could compensate for temporary vulnerability in supply lines. Diplomatic protocol said that victorious generals should not negotiate directly with defeated enemies, but I calculated that personal negotiation could achieve results that formal diplomatic channels could not. The principle of calculated audacity also applies to timing, recognizing when conditions make audacious approaches more likely to succeed than they would be under normal circumstances. The political chaos of revolutionary France created opportunities for rapid advancement that would have been impossible under stable conditions. The breakdown of traditional European alliance systems created opportunities for dramatic, territorial changes that would have been unthinkable in more stable times. Audacity must be supported by superior preparation, not used as a substitute for it. When I attempted seemingly impossible military maneuvers, I had studied the terrain more carefully than commanders who relied on conventional approaches. When I broke diplomatic protocol, I had analyzed the psychology of my negotiating partners more thoroughly than diplomats who followed standard procedures. Audacity without preparation is just recklessness with better publicity. I also learned that audacity requires what I call competence insurance, ensuring that your basic capabilities are so strong that you can afford to take unconventional risks. My artillery skills were so well developed that I could attempt unorthodox tactical approaches, knowing that my fundamental military competence would prevent small mistakes from becoming catastrophic failures. My administrative reforms were so effective that I could take political risks, knowing that governmental functionality would continue regardless of short-term disruptions. Calculated audacity means accepting that you will be criticized for your unconventional approaches, especially when they fail or even when they succeed in unexpected ways. The Egyptian expedition was criticized as strategic overreach, but it provided exactly the political visibility and romantic reputation that positioned me for my eventual rise to power. The continental system was criticized as economic warfare. That hurt French allies as much as British enemies, but it established the principle that British power could be challenged through systematic pressure, rather than just military confrontation. The psychological aspect of calculated audacity requires maintaining confidence in your analysis, even when others question your judgment. This doesn't mean ignoring valid criticism or refusing to reconsider your approach when new information becomes available. It means distinguishing between criticism based on conventional thinking and criticism based on genuine strategic insight. Modern applications of calculated audacity include launching businesses in markets that experts consider saturated, pursuing Career paths that conventional wisdom considers risky. Investing in technologies that mainstream analysis considers speculative, and building relationships that traditional networking approaches consider unlikely. The key is ensuring that your unconventional approach is based on analysis rather than wishful thinking. The most sophisticated form of calculated audacity is creating new categories of possibility rather than just succeeding within existing categories. When the first crowned myself emperor, I wasn't just seizing political power, I was creating a new form of legitimacy that combined revolutionary ideals with traditional authority structures. This audacity created possibilities that hadn't existed before. Rather than just succeeding within existing possibilities, calculated audacity also requires knowing when to return to conventional approaches. After establishing my reputation through unconventional means, I often found it advantageous to adopt more traditional methods that opponents expected and understood. The goal is not to be unconventional for its own sake, but to use unconventional approaches when they offer superior odds of achieving your objectives. The final element of calculated audacity is accepting that not all audacious approaches will succeed, but that the success rate of well-calculated audacious approaches often exceeds the success rate of conventional approaches applied to difficult situations. When facing truly challenging circumstances, the choice is often between a small chance of success through audacity and a negligible chance of success through conventional methods. Every situation where conventional approaches seem insufficient deserves audacity analysis. What unconventional approaches might be possible? What would success look like if audacious approaches worked? What would failure cost if audacious approaches failed? How do these odds compare to conventional alternatives? When you can answer these questions systematically, you transform audacity from gambling into calculation, and you discover opportunities that more cautious competitors never recognize. Asterisk, asterisk, every major risk affects other people's interests, and your success often depends more on managing those affected parties than on the technical execution of your plan. I learned this lesson through both triumph and disaster. My rise to power succeeded largely because I understood how to align others' interests with my objectives, while my eventual downfall resulted partly from my failure to maintain those alignments as circumstances changed. The foundation of stakeholder management lies in recognizing that people support your risks not because they believe in you personally, but because they believe your success will advance their own interests. This isn't cynicism, it's realism that allows you to build more durable and effective alliances. When the first negotiated the Concordat with Pope Pius VII, both sides understood that we were trading specific advantages rather than expressing mutual affection. I developed a systematic approach to mapping stakeholder interests before undertaking any major initiative. First, identify all parties whose interests would be significantly affected by your proposed action. Second, analyze what each party stands to gain or lose from your success or failure. Third, determine what each party has the power to do to help or hinder your efforts. Fourth, design your approach to maximize support and minimize opposition by addressing stakeholder concerns proactively. The coup of 18 Brumaire succeeded because I had carefully analyzed the interests of every significant political faction in France. The moderate Republicans wanted stability and competent administration. The military wanted effective leadership and resources for successful campaigns. The business community wanted economic policies that supported trade and industry. The general population wanted security and prosperity. I structured my rise to power to address each group's primary concerns while building a coalition broad enough to overcome opposition from excluded factions. Managing stakeholders requires understanding that different parties have different definitions of success, different timelines for evaluating results, and different tolerance for various types of risks. Military officers evaluated my leadership based on battlefield results and career advancement opportunities. Civilian administrators evaluated my policies based on governmental efficiency and their own bureaucratic authority. Foreign allies evaluated our relationships based on how French power could be used to advance their regional objectives. I learned to communicate with different stakeholders in languages they understood and about outcomes they valued. When addressing soldiers, I emphasized honor, glory, and the practical benefits of successful campaigns. When addressing merchants, I emphasized economic opportunities and trade advantages. When addressing intellectuals, I emphasized the advancement of knowledge and rational governance. The core message remained consistent, but the emphasis shifted to resonate with each audience's priorities. The most sophisticated aspect of stakeholder management involves creating what I call aligned incentives, structuring situations so that others succeed when you succeed and struggle when you struggle. The satellite kingdoms I established throughout Europe operated on this principle. Local rulers maintained their positions and expanded their power by supporting French objectives, while French success provided them with resources and protection they could not obtain independently. I also learned the importance of managing stakeholder expectations continuously, rather than just at the beginning of an initiative. People's support for your risks changes as circumstances evolve, as they gain new information, and as their own situations change. The German princes who initially welcomed French influence as liberation from Austrian domination eventually came to resent French control as it became more burdensome than Austrian oversight had been. Stakeholder management requires accepting that you cannot satisfy everyone and that attempting to do so often results in satisfying no one. I learned to prioritize stakeholders based on their importance to my immediate objectives, their long-term strategic value, and their ability to influence other stakeholders. Core supporters received the most attention and the best terms. Peripheral supporters received adequate attention to maintain their cooperation. Opponents received enough attention to prevent them from organizing effective resistance, but not enough to suggest that opposition was a viable strategy. The most dangerous mistake in stakeholder management is assuming that initial support will continue automatically. Political conditions change, economic circumstances evolve, and people's priorities shift over time. The continental system initially received strong support from French merchants and manufacturers who expected to benefit from reduced British competition, but as the economic costs became apparent and alternative markets failed to develop, that same business community became increasingly opposed to the policy. I developed early warning systems to identify when stakeholder support was weakening before it reached crisis levels. Regular communication with key supporters, systematic monitoring of public opinion, intelligence networks that reported on private conversations among important figures, and analysis of economic and social indicators that might predict changing attitudes. This information allowed me to address problems while they were still manageable, rather than waiting until opposition had crystallized into organized resistance. Managing international allies required even more sophisticated approaches because their interests often conflicted with each other as well as with French objectives. Austrian cooperation with French objectives often came at Prussian expense, which made Prussia more likely to seek alternative alliances. Russian support for continental system policies conflicted with Russian economic interests, which made that support inherently unstable. I had to balance these competing interests carefully to maintain coalition unity while pursuing French strategic goals. The art of stakeholder management also involves knowing when to ignore stakeholder concerns that conflict with fundamental objectives. The old aristocratic families never accepted my legitimacy and never would, regardless of how I addressed their concerns. Attempting to satisfy them would have required abandoning the revolutionary principles that formed the foundation of my power. I chose to neutralize their opposition rather than court their support, while focusing my stakeholder management efforts on groups whose support was both achievable and valuable. Modern risk-takers face similar challenges in managing the interests of investors, employees, customers, suppliers, regulators, community groups, and family members who are affected by their decisions. The same principles apply. Understand what each stakeholder values. Communicate in terms they find meaningful. Structure initiatives to align interests where possible. Prioritize stakeholders based on their strategic importance, and monitor changing attitudes continuously. Digital communications and social media have accelerated the pace of stakeholder management, while expanding the number of parties who consider themselves stakeholders in your decisions. This evolution requires more systematic and proactive approaches to stakeholder communication, but the fundamental principles remain unchanged. People support risks that advance their interests and oppose risks that threaten their interests. The ultimate goal of stakeholder management is not universal popularity, but sustainable support for your key objectives. This requires making trade-offs between competing interests, accepting that some parties will remain opposed regardless of your efforts, and focusing your limited time and attention on relationships that provide the greatest strategic value. Master this art, and you transform individual, calculated risks into sustainable, strategic advantages that compound over time. Every significant risk you contemplate should include stakeholder analysis. Who will be affected by your decision? What do they have the power to do in response? How can you address their concerns without compromising your core objectives? And how will you monitor and maintain their support throughout the execution of your plans? Answer these questions before you act, and you multiply your chances of success while minimizing the likelihood that opposition from affected parties will undermine even well-executed initiatives. My invasion of Russia was a calculated risk that failed catastrophically, and it taught me more about risk assessment than all my victories combined. The difference between learning from failure and being destroyed by it lies in your ability to extract valuable intelligence from what went wrong without losing confidence in your fundamental approach to calculated risk-taking. Failure is the most expensive form of education, but it's also often the most valuable. The Russian campaign began with calculations that seemed sound based on my previous experience. I had defeated every major European power through rapid campaigns that achieved decisive results before enemies could fully mobilize their resources. I calculated that Russia, despite its vast territory, would be forced to fight a conventional campaign to protect Moscow and St. Petersburg. I expected that defeating the main Russian armies would lead to political collapse and negotiated peace. Just as it had with Austria and Prussia, every element of my calculation proved incorrect, but not because I had failed to think systematically about the risks involved. I had prepared for supply difficulties by organizing the largest logistics operation in military history. I had prepared for Russian resistance by assembling the largest army Europe had ever seen. I had prepared for extended operations by negotiating alliances that would protect my flanks and provide additional forces. My failure wasn't due to inadequate preparation, it was due to fundamental misunderstanding of the strategic environment I was entering. The first lesson I extracted from this failure was the danger of applying successful patterns to fundamentally different situations. My previous victories had occurred against European powers that fought conventional campaigns for limited political objectives. Russia's defensive strategy of trading space for time, combined with their willingness to burn their own cities rather than surrender them intact, represented a completely different approach to warfare that my experience hadn't prepared me to understand. I also learned about the compounding effect of small miscalculations in complex operations. The Russian campaign involved thousands of interdependent variables: weather, supply, disease, morale, enemy capabilities, ally reliability, diplomatic developments. Small errors in estimating any of these variables might have been manageable individually, but their cumulative effect created cascading failures that eventually overwhelmed even my extensive preparations. The psychological aspect of learning from calculated failures proved as important as the analytical aspect. The temptation after major setbacks is either to become paralyzed by fear of future failures or to become reckless in attempting to recover losses quickly. Both responses destroy your ability to make sound risk calculations. I had to learn to maintain confidence in my analytical methods while acknowledging that my specific assessments had been seriously flawed. I developed what I called failure analysis protocols, systematic methods for extracting maximum value from setbacks without allowing them to undermine future decision-making capabilities. First, separate operational failures from strategic failures. Operational failures result from poor execution of sound plans and can be corrected through improved implementation. Strategic failures result from fundamental misunderstanding of the situation and require rethinking basic assumptions. Second, identify which assumptions proved incorrect and why. In Russia, I had assumed that the campaign would follow patterns established in previous European wars. I had assumed that Russian leadership would prioritize preserving their army over preserving their territory. I had assumed that Russian logistics were as vulnerable to disruption as Austrian or Prussian logistics had been. Each of these assumptions seemed reasonable based on my experience, but each proved dangerously wrong in the Russian context. Third, distinguish between controllable factors that contributed to failure and uncontrollable factors that influenced the outcome. I could have controlled my decision-making timeline better, avoiding the pressure to begin the campaign later in the season than optimal weather conditions recommended. I could have controlled my strategic objectives better, perhaps settling for limited gains rather than pursuing complete victory. But I could not have controlled the unprecedented severity of the 1812 winter or the Russian decision to abandon conventional military logic. Fourth, extract positive lessons from negative outcomes. The Russian campaign demonstrated the effectiveness of my organizational and logistics innovations, even though they proved insufficient for the specific challenges involved. It revealed the loyalty and competence of my officer corps under extreme adversity. It provided valuable intelligence about Russian capabilities and strategic thinking that would be useful in future interactions. The most important lesson from the Russian failure was understanding the difference between acceptable risks and existential risks. Previous campaigns had involved acceptable risks if they failed. I would lose battles, territory, or political position, but I would retain the core capabilities necessary for future efforts. The Russian campaign involved existential risk. Its failure threatened the entire foundation of my power and left me vulnerable to coordinated attacks by all my remaining enemies. I learned to recognize the warning signs that indicate when a calculated risk is becoming an existential gamble. When the success of your current initiative becomes necessary for your survival, rather than just beneficial for your advancement, you have crossed from calculated risk into dangerous territory. When failure would eliminate your ability to take future risks rather than just set back your current timeline, you need to reconsider your commitment level. The recovery from calculated failures requires what I call intelligent persistence, continuing to pursue your fundamental objectives while adapting your methods based on what you've learned. After Russia, I couldn't abandon my strategic goals of maintaining French hegemony in Europe, but I had to adapt my approach to account for new understanding of coalition warfare, Russian capabilities, and the limitations of rapid campaign strategies. In certain environments, I also learned that the speed of learning from failure often determines whether setbacks become temporary obstacles or permanent defeats. The coalition forces that eventually defeated me were able to adapt their strategies based on observing my methods over many campaigns. They learned from their failures faster than I learned from mine, eventually developing approaches that neutralized my traditional advantages. Modern applications of failure analysis include conducting postmortems on unsuccessful business ventures, career setbacks, investment losses, and relationship problems. The same analytical framework applies. Separate operational from strategic failures, identify incorrect assumptions, distinguish controllable from uncontrollable factors, and extract positive lessons while maintaining confidence in sound decision-making. Principles. The goal of learning from calculated failures is not to avoid future risks, but to improve your ability to assess and manage them. Failure provides information that success cannot. It reveals the boundaries of your capabilities, the limits of your knowledge, and the gaps in your preparation. Used properly, this information makes you a more effective risk-taker, not a more cautious one. Every calculated risk you take should include plans for learning from failure, as well as capitalizing on success. How will you analyze what went wrong? If your plans don't work out, how will you distinguish between execution problems and strategy problems? How will you maintain your risk-taking capabilities while adapting your approach based on new information? Answer these questions before you act, and you transform even failures into valuable investments in your long-term success. My rise from second lieutenant to emperor didn't happen through a single dramatic gamble. It resulted from hundreds of small, calculated risks that built upon each other over 15 years. Most people understand compound interest in financial terms, but they fail to recognize that the same mathematical principle applies to strategic risk-taking. Small risks, taken consistently and intelligently, create exponential rather than linear growth in your capabilities and opportunities. I began applying this principle unconsciously during my early military career, when major risks were simply beyond my reach due to limited rank and resources. As a young artillery officer, I couldn't risk entire campaigns or reshape European politics, but I could risk my reputation on technical innovations, volunteer for challenging assignments, and speak up with strategic suggestions that exceeded my formal authority. Each small risk either enhanced my capabilities or taught me valuable lessons with minimal cost. The key insight is that small risks allow you to build what I call risk-taking muscles, the confidence, experience, and analytical skills necessary for larger, more consequential decisions. When I finally had the opportunity to risk entire armies and empires, I had already practiced the mental habits and decision-making processes thousands of times on smaller scales. This preparation meant that massive risks felt manageable because they were built on foundations of proven competence. My progression through military ranks illustrates how small risks compound into major transformations. As a lieutenant, I risked minor reprimands by studying beyond my assigned materials and developing expertise in subjects not required for my immediate duties. As a captain, I risked career advancement by supporting revolutionary political causes when the outcome was still uncertain. As a major, I risked my reputation by proposing unconventional tactical approaches that senior officers might have rejected. Each successful, small risk expanded my range of possibilities for the next risk. Early success in artillery techniques led to opportunities for more significant technical responsibilities. Political reliability during the revolution led to faster promotion and greater autonomy. Tactical innovations led to strategic responsibilities that would have been impossible to obtain through conventional career progression. The compound effect works because small risks provide multiple types of value simultaneously. They build practical experience in risk assessment and management. They establish track records that increase others' confidence in your judgment. They expand your network of relationships with people who might provide future opportunities. They develop your tolerance for uncertainty and your resilience in the face of setbacks. Most importantly, they teach you to distinguish between risks worth taking and risks worth avoiding. I learned to design what I call progressive risk sequences, series of related risks where each builds on the lessons and advantages gained from previous ones. My Italian campaign began with small tactical risks that tested enemy capabilities and revealed their strategic vulnerabilities. Success in these small engagements provided the intelligence and confidence necessary for larger operational risks. Success at the operational level created opportunities for strategic risks that reshaped the entire political landscape. The most powerful aspect of compound risk-taking is that it changes not just your external circumstances, but your internal capabilities. Early in my career, commanding a battery of cannons felt like enormous responsibility, requiring careful calculation of every decision. By the time I commanded armies of hundreds of thousands, the mental processes had become so developed through practice that complex strategic decisions felt as manageable as tactical decisions once had. Small risks also provide what I call learning optionality, opportunities to discover capabilities and interests you didn't know you possessed. My early political writing during the revolution revealed talents for persuasion and strategic thinking that purely military responsibilities had never tested. These discoveries opened entirely new dimensions of opportunity that I could never have anticipated when I was focused solely on artillery techniques. The mathematics of compound risk-taking follow exponential rather than linear patterns. A 10% improvement in capabilities might not seem significant in isolation, but 10 consecutive 10% improvements result in doubling your effective capacity. More importantly, each improvement expands your range of accessible opportunities, which means that 10% improvements apply to increasingly larger bases of possibility. I also discovered that small risks often carry disproportionate learning value because they allow you to experiment without catastrophic consequences. When I tested new tactical approaches during minor engagements, failure might cost me a few casualties or some temporary embarrassment, but it wouldn't destroy my army or end my career. This relatively safe environment for experimentation accelerated my development as a strategic thinker and risk calculator. The principle extends beyond individual development to organizational and institutional growth. Each administrative reform I implemented in conquered territories was a small risk that tested different approaches to governance. Successful experiments were expanded and refined. Unsuccessful experiments were abandoned with minimal cost. This systematic approach to institutional innovation allowed me to develop governmental capabilities far more quickly than trying to implement perfect systems from the beginning. Modern applications of compound risk-taking include taking on challenging projects that stretch your capabilities, volunteering for responsibilities slightly beyond your current experience level, investing small amounts in learning new skills or exploring new industries, and building relationships with people whose expertise or networks could provide future opportunities. The key is ensuring that each risk builds capability and creates options for future risks. The most common mistake people make with compound risk-taking is either taking risks that are too small to provide meaningful learning, or taking risks that are too large to be sustainable. Risks that are too small don't develop your capabilities or expand your opportunities significantly. Risks that are too large can destroy your ability to continue taking risks if they fail. The optimal size for compound risks is large enough to stretch your capabilities, while remaining small enough that failure won't eliminate future opportunities. I learned to calibrate risk size based on my current capability level and the robustness of my strategic reserves. Early in my career, when my capabilities were limited and my reserves were minimal, even small risks had to be chosen very carefully. As my capabilities and reserves grew, I could afford to take larger individual risks because my overall capacity to absorb setbacks had expanded. The compound effect also requires patience and long-term thinking that many people find difficult to maintain. Small risks often produce small immediate results, even when they create substantial long-term value. The temptation is to abandon systematic approaches in favor of larger, more dramatic gambles that promise immediate transformation. But dramatic gambles usually fail, while systematic risk-taking usually succeeds. Every significant achievement in your life should be viewed as the endpoint of a compound risk sequence rather than the result of a single decisive moment. This perspective helps you recognize opportunities for small risks that might seem insignificant individually, but could prove transformative collectively. It also helps you maintain motivation during periods when individual risks aren't producing dramatic results, because you understand that the real power comes from the accumulation of many risks over time rather than from any single success. Start building your compound risk-taking practice today by identifying one small risk you could take this week that would slightly expand your capabilities or opportunities. Make it small enough that failure won't hurt significantly, but large enough that success will provide genuine value. Repeat this process consistently, and you'll discover that calculated risk-taking becomes not just a skill, but a way of life that continuously expands your range of possibilities. Asterisk. The Battle of Janoelstedt required the most complex risk calculation of my career, because I faced two separate enemy armies of unknown size, while my own forces were divided and operating on uncertain intelligence. This situation demanded what I call advanced risk calculation, systematic methods for making sound decisions when multiple variables interact in unpredictable ways and when the consequences of error could be catastrophic. Basic risk calculation works well for simple situations with limited variables and clear outcomes. Advanced risk calculation becomes necessary when dealing with complex systems where small changes can produce large effects, where multiple stakeholders have conflicting interests, where information is incomplete and potentially misleading, and where the time pressure prevents exhaustive analysis. These are the conditions where most important decisions occur. I developed a framework that I used whenever facing complex risk calculations. First, map all significant variables and their relationships to each other. Second, identify which variables you can control, which you can influence, and which you must accept as given. Third, create decision trees that show how different combinations of variables might produce different outcomes. Fourth, assign probabilities to different scenarios based on available evidence. Fifth, calculate the expected value of different courses of action. Sixth, factor in your risk tolerance and strategic reserves. The Janoelstedt situation illustrates this framework in action. The significant variables included the size and location of Prussian forces, their commanders' likely strategic plans, their coordination with Russian allies, weather conditions affecting movement and communication, my own forces' capabilities under different deployment scenarios, and the political consequences of various military outcomes. Each variable affected multiple others in ways that made simple prediction impossible. I could control my army's movements and deployment, but not their exact capabilities under battle conditions. I could influence Prussian decision-making through deception and rapid movements, but not their fundamental strategic choices. I had to accept as given the basic military strength of both sides, the terrain constraints, and the political pressures driving Prussian behavior. The decision tree for this situation included branches for different Prussian strategic plans concentration. For single decisive battle, division to protect multiple objectives, retreat to await Russian reinforcement. Different weather scenarios, clear conditions favoring rapid movement, poor conditions slowing all operations, and different performance levels from my own subordinate commander's excellent coordination allowing complex maneuvers, adequate coordination requiring simple plans, poor coordination demanding direct personal control, assigning probabilities, required synthesizing intelligence reports, understanding Prussian military culture and recent strategic patterns, analyzing personality profiles of enemy commanders, and evaluating how weather patterns typically developed in that region during October. None of these assessments could be perfectly accurate, but systematic analysis produced probability estimates that were more reliable than intuitive guesses. The expected value calculation weighed potential gains against potential losses for different courses of action. Concentrating my forces offered higher probability of decisive victory, but risked allowing one Prussian army to escape. Dividing my forces offered opportunities to defeat both enemy armies, but risked being defeated in detail. If coordination failed, defensive positioning offered maximum safety, but minimal opportunity for strategic gains that would justify the campaign's costs. My risk tolerance and strategic reserves affected the final calculation significantly. I could afford tactical setbacks if they led to strategic advantages, but I could not afford strategic defeat that would eliminate my ability to continue operations. I had sufficient reserves to absorb casualties from aggressive tactics, but not sufficient reserves to survive the loss of entire army corps through poor coordination. The most sophisticated aspect of advanced risk calculation is accounting for what I call interaction effects, ways that combining multiple risks or opportunities can produce results that differ dramatically from the sum of their individual parts. At Jana-Warstedt, dividing my forces created individual risks for each cause, but it also created the opportunity for achieving decisive results against both enemy armies simultaneously if the coordination succeeded. I also learned to incorporate tail risk analysis, systematic consideration of low probability events that could produce catastrophic consequences. The probability that both Prussian armies would coordinate perfectly while both my corps performed poorly was low, but the consequences would have been devastating. I designed my plans to minimize exposure to such tail risks while maintaining ability to capitalize on favorable low probability scenarios. Advanced risk calculation requires distinguishing between uncertainty and risk. Risk involves situations where you can assign meaningful probabilities to different outcomes based on available information. Uncertainty involves situations where the underlying probability distributions are unknown or unknowable. Different situations require different analytical approaches and different decision-making criteria. Time constraints force trade-offs between analytical completeness and decision timeliness. Perfect analysis is rarely possible under operational conditions so advanced. Risk calculation must include methods for making sound decisions with incomplete information. I developed rules for determining when additional analysis would be valuable versus when additional delay would be costly. I also learned to recognize when intuition should override analysis and when analysis should override intuition. Intuition proved valuable for recognizing patterns that formal analysis might miss, especially regarding human behavior and organizational dynamics. Analysis proved valuable for avoiding cognitive biases and emotional responses that could distort judgment. The art lies in knowing which source of insight to trust in different types of situations. Modern applications of advanced risk calculation include investment decisions involving multiple correlated assets, business strategy in rapidly changing markets, career decisions with long-term implications, and personal relationships where multiple complex factors interact. The same framework applies. map variables and relationships. Identify what you can control versus influence versus accept. Create decision trees for different scenarios. Assign probabilities based on available evidence. Calculate expected values, and factor in risk tolerance. Digital tools now allow for more sophisticated modeling than was possible during my era, but the fundamental principles remain unchanged. Monte Carlo simulations, sensitivity analysis, and scenario planning are modern techniques that implement the same logical framework I developed for military campaigns. The technology has advanced, but the need for systematic thinking about complex risks remains constant. The most dangerous trap in advanced risk calculation is false precision, creating elaborate models that give the illusion of certainty when dealing with inherently uncertain situations. The goal is not to predict the future precisely, but to make better decisions under uncertainty. A rough model that captures the essential relationships between key variables often provides more value than a sophisticated model that incorporates numerous irrelevant details. Advanced risk calculation also requires emotional discipline to avoid common cognitive biases that distort judgment. Confirmation bias leads people to seek information that supports their preferred conclusions. Anchoring bias causes people to rely too heavily on initial information. Availability bias makes recent or memorable events seem more probable than they actually are. Systematic analytical frameworks help counteract these biases by forcing consideration of alternative possibilities and contrary evidence. The ultimate goal of advanced risk calculation is not to eliminate uncertainty, but to make peace with it, while maximizing your ability to benefit from favorable outcomes and minimize damage from unfavorable ones. Master these methods, and you gain the ability to make sound decisions in complex situations where others become paralyzed by the apparent impossibility of perfect analysis. This capability alone will give you enormous advantages in a world where most important opportunities involve exactly the kind of complex, uncertain, high-stakes decisions that advanced risk calculation is designed to handle. Asterisk, the code Napoleon still governs legal systems across 4 continents, while my military victories are studied only by historians. This contrast taught me the most important lesson about calculated risk-taking. The risks worth taking are those that create value, extending far beyond your immediate objectives and surviving long after your personal involvement ends. Legacy thinking transforms calculated risk from a tool for personal advancement into a method for building lasting significance. I began understanding this principle during my early administrative work in conquered territories, when I realized that military victories meant nothing if they didn't translate into stable political and social improvements. Battles won territory, but only systematic institution building could hold that territory and derive lasting benefit from the conquest. This insight led me to invest as much energy in legal, educational, and administrative reforms as I devoted to military campaigns. Legacy thinking requires extending your planning horizon beyond immediate results to generational impact. When I established the University of France, the immediate risk was significant diverting resources from military needs while creating an institution that might produce critics of my policies. But I calculated that educational systems would determine France's long-term competitive position more than any individual military campaign could. The short-term costs were acceptable given the long-term strategic value. The most sophisticated aspect of legacy-focused risk-taking is designing initiatives that become self-sustaining and self-improving over time. The legal codes I established didn't just solve immediate problems, they created frameworks that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining core principles. The administrative systems I built didn't just manage current responsibilities, they developed capabilities that could handle growing complexity and expanding scope. I learnt to distinguish between risks that consume resources and risks that create resources. Military campaigns typically consumed enormous resources while producing temporary advantages that required constant maintenance. Educational and legal reforms required substantial initial investments, but generated increasing value over time as they shaped how entire societies developed. The mathematics of legacy thinking favor investments that appreciate rather than depreciate. The institutional reforms that proved most valuable were those that aligned individual incentives with collective benefits. The merit-based promotion systems established in military and civilian bureaucracies didn't just improve immediate performance, they created cultures that continued attracting and developing talent long after my direct involvement ended. People worked to improve the systems, because improving the systems advanced their personal interests. Legacy thinking also requires accepting that your most important contributions might not be recognized during your lifetime. The administrative and legal innovations that proved most durable were often criticized when I implemented them. Traditional aristocrats opposed merit-based systems because they threatened hereditary privileges. Military commanders sometimes resented systematic approaches to promotion and logistics because they preferred informal influence networks. But I calculated that long-term institutional strength mattered more than short-term political convenience. I developed what I call generational risk assessment, analyzing how current decisions would affect not just immediate outcomes, but also the capabilities and constraints facing future decision-makers. The educational systems I established would determine what kinds of leaders France could produce 20 years later. The legal frameworks I created would determine what kinds of economic and social development would be possible for decades. These generational effects often mattered more than immediate tactical advantages. The principle extends to understanding that legacy risks often require different analytical frameworks than immediate risks. Short-term risks can be evaluated based on direct cause and effect relationships that operate within predictable timeframes. Legacy risks must be evaluated based on how they interact with larger social, economic, and technological trends that might take decades to fully develop. Modern applications of legacy thinking include building businesses that solve important problems rather than just generating quick profits, developing skills that become more valuable over time rather than just meeting immediate job requirements, creating relationships based on mutual respect and shared values rather than just immediate convenience, and making investments that compound over decades rather than just producing quick returns. The most challenging aspect of legacy-focused risk-taking is maintaining motivation for initiatives that might not produce visible results for years or decades. Human psychology naturally focuses on immediate feedback and short-term results. Legacy thinking requires developing what I call deferred gratification, confidence, the ability to invest substantial effort in projects whose value might not become apparent until long after you've moved on to other priorities. I found that legacy projects often provided unexpected short-term benefits that made the long-term focus sustainable. The systematic approach to military education that I implemented to improve long-term French military capabilities also produced immediate improvements in tactical performance. The legal reforms designed to create stable governance also reduced immediate administrative conflicts and improved economic efficiency. Legacy thinking requires understanding that your most lasting contributions might be indirect, the people you influence, the ideas you propagate, the systems you improve, the precedents you establish. My direct military conquests were temporary, but the organizational methods I developed influenced military thinking for generations. The specific territories I controlled eventually changed hands, but the governmental innovations I implemented shaped how modern states operate The mathematics of compound impact mean that small improvements in important systems can produce enormous long-term value. A slight improvement in educational quality affects thousands of students, who then affect thousands of others throughout their careers. A modest innovation in legal procedure influences countless future legal decisions. A minor advance in administrative efficiency touches millions of citizen interactions over decades. Legacy-focused risk-taking also requires humility about what you can control and what you can only influence. I could control the initial design and implementation of institutional reforms, but I could not control how future leaders would modify or apply them. The goal was to create foundations robust enough to survive imperfect stewardship, while flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances. The ultimate test of legacy thinking is whether your contributions make it easier for others to solve problems and seize opportunities that you could never have anticipated. The educational and administrative systems I established gave France capabilities for dealing with industrial development, democratic governance, and international competition that didn't exist during my era. That adaptability proved more valuable than any specific solutions I provided for immediate problems. Every significant risk you contemplate should include legacy analysis. How will this decision affect your long-term capabilities and reputation? What systems or relationships will it strengthen or weaken? How will it position you for future opportunities that don't currently exist? What value will it create for others who depend on your success? How will it contribute to solving problems larger than your immediate objectives? Legacy thinking transforms calculated risk-taking from a tool for personal advancement into a method for creating lasting value that compounds across generations. Master this perspective, and your risks become investments not just in your own success, but in the success of everyone who will build upon the foundations you establish. This is how calculated risk-taking transcends individual achievement to become a force for lasting progress and enduring significance. Asterisk. Even my abdication at Fontainebleau was a calculated risk recognizing that stepping back voluntarily would preserve more options than being forced out through continued resistance. This final political calculation demonstrates that mastering calculated risk-taking means knowing not just when to advance boldly, but also when strategic retreat creates better long-term positioning. Now you must apply these principles to create your own revolution of calculated courage. Your personal risk-taking revolution begins with honest assessment of your current position and capabilities. Most people either overestimate their risk tolerance because they confuse wishful thinking with calculation, or underestimate their capabilities because they focus on potential failures rather than potential successes. True, calculated risk-taking requires clear-eyed evaluation of both your strengths and your limitations. I developed a systematic approach for this self-assessment that you can adapt to your own circumstances. First, analyze your current strategic reserves, financial resources that you can afford to lose, professional relationships that could provide opportunities or support during setbacks, skills and knowledge that remain valuable regardless of changing circumstances, and personal resilience that allows you to persist through temporary failures. Second, identify your risk-taking experience and track record. What calculated risks have you taken previously? What were the outcomes? What did you learn from both successes and failures? What patterns emerge from your decision-making history? This analysis reveals both your natural risk-taking tendencies and your areas for improvement. Third, map your stakeholder relationships and responsibilities. Who depends on your success? Who would be affected by your failures? What obligations do you have that limit your risk-taking flexibility? What support systems exist to help you recover from setbacks? Understanding these relationships helps you calibrate appropriate risk levels and design approaches that account for others' interests. Fourth, analyze your competitive environment, and market conditions. What trends are working in your favor or against you? What opportunities exist that others might be missing? What threats could emerge that would change your situation dramatically? Where do your capabilities provide advantages over current and potential competitors? Once you understand your starting position, you can begin designing what I call progressive risk sequences, series of calculated risks that build systematically toward larger objectives while developing your capabilities and expanding your options. Start with risks that stretch your abilities while remaining within your current resource base and risk tolerance. Your first calculated risks should focus on building what are developed as risk-taking infrastructure, the knowledge, relationships, resources, and experience necessary for larger future risks. This might mean taking on challenging projects at work that expand your skills, building relationships with people whose expertise or networks could provide future opportunities, or investing time in learning about areas where you might want to take risks later. The key is ensuring that each risk provides multiple types of value regardless of its immediate outcome. A challenging assignment might advance your career if successful, but it will also develop your capabilities and demonstrate your willingness to take on difficult responsibilities, even if the specific project doesn't succeed perfectly. This approach means that even failed risks contribute to your long-term development. I learned to design risks with what I call learning optionality, ensuring that each calculated risk teaches you something valuable about yourself, your environment, or your opportunities, regardless of whether it achieves its primary objective. This approach transforms every risk into an investment in your risk-taking capabilities. Even when immediate outcomes disappoint, timing your personal risk-taking revolution requires balancing preparation with action. You can never have perfect information or ideal conditions, but you can develop systematic approaches to gathering sufficient information and recognizing favorable conditions when they appear. The goal is not to eliminate uncertainty, but to become comfortable making sound decisions despite uncertainty. Create your personal risk-taking framework by adapting the principles I've shared to your specific circumstances and objectives. What information do you need before taking significant risks? How will you evaluate potential opportunities? What criteria will you use to determine acceptable loss levels? How will you manage stakeholder relationships? What will trigger your decision to act versus wait for better conditions? Practice this framework on progressively larger risks over time. Start with decisions where the stakes are meaningful but manageable, and gradually expand to more significant opportunities as your experience and capabilities grow. Each successful application builds confidence and competence for the next level of challenge. Develop systematic methods for learning from both successes and failures. What worked well? What could be improved? What assumptions proved incorrect? What unexpected opportunities or challenges emerged? This analytical discipline accelerates your development as a calculated risk-taker and prevents you from repeating mistakes. Build your support network deliberately rather than accidentally. Identify people whose expertise, networks, or resources could be valuable for different types of risks you might want to take. Cultivate these relationships before you need them, providing value to others so they'll be motivated to help when opportunities arise. Monitor your progress systematically. Are you taking appropriate risks relative to your objectives and capabilities? Are you learning and developing from each experience? Are you building toward larger opportunities that align with your long-term goals? Are you maintaining the balance between prudent caution and bold action that characterizes effective, calculated risk-taking? Your personal revolution also requires accepting that calculated risk-taking is a lifetime practice rather than a destination you reach. Market conditions change, your capabilities evolve, your objectives shift, and new opportunities emerge continuously. The goal is to develop sustainable approaches to risk assessment and management rather than to solve the challenge once and forever. The most important element of your personal risk-taking revolution is developing what I call strategic courage, the willingness to act decisively on careful analysis, even when outcomes remain uncertain. This isn't reckless bravery or wishful optimism. It's the confident application of systematic thinking to important opportunities, backed by adequate preparation and appropriate reserves. Begin today by identifying one calculated risk you could take this week that would advance your larger objectives, while remaining within your current capabilities and resource constraints. Apply the principles you've learned to analyze this opportunity systematically, prepare thoroughly, act decisively, and learn from whatever results. Your risk-taking revolution starts with a single calculated step toward opportunities that others are too cautious to pursue. Take that step with the confidence that comes from systematic preparation, and you begin the transformation from someone who dreams about change to someone who creates it. Through the measured application of strategic courage, from my exile on St. Helena, watching the Atlantic waves crash against these remote shores, I reflect on a lifetime of calculated risks that reshaped Europe and changed the course of history. Some of those risks elevated me from obscure artillery officer to Emperor of France. Others cost me everything I had built. Both the triumphs and the disasters taught me truths about calculated risk-taking that I wish I had understood more clearly. During my years of power, the risks worth taking are those that expand your capabilities, rather than just exploiting your current advantages. My greatest successes came when I used calculated risks to develop new skills, build new relationships, create new systems, and establish new precedents. My greatest failures came when I used risks primarily to defend existing positions or recover past losses. Forward-looking risks create lasting value. Backward-looking risks usually create temporary solutions to permanent problems. Calculated risk-taking is ultimately about freedom, the freedom to choose your own path rather than accepting whatever circumstances others create for you. Every time you take a well-calculated risk, you expand your range of choices and reduce your dependence on factors beyond your control. Every time you avoid appropriate risks out of fear or inertia, you surrender some of your freedom to shape your own destiny. The mathematical principle that guided my entire career was this: the compound effect of small, intelligent risks almost always exceeds the impact of large, dramatic gambles. I built an empire through thousands of calculated decisions, not through a few brilliant strokes of genius. You will build your success the same way, through consistent application of sound principles, rather than through lucky breaks or perfect timing. Trust your preparation more than your inspiration, but trust your inspiration more than others. Conventional wisdom. I spent countless hours studying maps, analyzing intelligence, and planning logistics because thorough preparation multiplied the effectiveness of every risk I took. But I also learned to act on strategic insights that contradicted accepted military doctrine when my analysis suggested that unconventional approaches offered superior odds. Never take a risk that you cannot afford to lose, but remember that the greatest risk is often refusing to risk anything at all. Playing it safe guarantees safe results, which means mediocre results in a world where others are taking calculated risks to achieve extraordinary outcomes. The real danger lies not in taking appropriate risks, but in allowing fear to prevent you from pursuing opportunities that could transform your life. Learn to read people as carefully as you read circumstances, because your success will depend more on understanding human nature than on understanding technical details. I won battles by understanding my enemy's psychology better than they understood it themselves. You will achieve your objectives by understanding what motivates the people whose cooperation you need, and what constraints shape their decision-making. Speed remains one of your greatest potential advantages in a world where most people move slowly because they're trying to achieve perfect certainty before acting. Move faster than others expect, but move based on systematic preparation rather than impulsive emotion. The combination of thorough analysis and rapid execution will give you opportunities that neither pure speed nor pure deliberation can provide. Build systems that work without your constant attention, because your most important contribution will be creating value that continues long after your direct involvement ends. I am remembered not for individual battles I won, but for institutions I established that shaped how societies function. Focus on building capabilities, relationships, and frameworks that will generate value for years rather than just solving immediate problems. The greatest leaders are those who make calculated risk-taking easier for others. Share what you learn, teach others to think systematically about uncertainty, and create environments where people can take appropriate risks without fear of unfair punishment for intelligent failures. Your legacy will be measured not just by what you achieve personally, but by what you enable others to achieve. Accept that every significant risk involves some element of uncertainty that cannot be eliminated through analysis or preparation. The goal is not to predict the future perfectly, but to position yourself to benefit from multiple possible futures while maintaining resilience against unfavorable developments. Embrace uncertainty as the price of opportunity, rather than fighting it as an obstacle to progress. My final counsel is this: calculated risk-taking is not just a tool for advancement. It is a way of living that honors your potential while acknowledging your limitations. It requires the humility to prepare thoroughly, combined with the courage to act decisively. It demands the wisdom to learn from failure, combined with the persistence to continue pursuing important objectives despite temporary setbacks. The world needs people who will take intelligent risks to solve important problems, create valuable innovations, and build beneficial institutions. Your willingness to master calculated risk-taking makes you part of a tradition that extends from ancient military commanders to modern entrepreneurs, from historical statesmen to contemporary leaders who shape the future through bold but thoughtful action. Begin where you are, with what you have, using the principles you've learned. Start small, think systematically, prepare thoroughly, act decisively, learn continuously. Each calculated risk you take successfully expands your capabilities for the next one. Each failure you learn from makes you more effective at evaluating future opportunities. The artillery officer who became emperor leaves you with this final truth: your potential is limited, not by your circumstances, but by your willingness to take calculated risks that expand those circumstances. The principles of calculated risk-taking are available to anyone willing to study, practice, and apply them systematically. Your empire awaits. Build it one calculated risk at a time.